Hello everyone, a very good morning and welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep. Welcome to the daily Hindu news analysis. So let's begin our discussion by first looking at the topics we are going to discuss. I have chosen 10 important articles from today's newspaper. We have quite a number of articles in today's Delhi edition and I have chosen 10 important articles. We have 4 articles which require a detailed analysis specifically for your mains and 6 smaller articles for the prelims examination. So I'm going to cover all these topics comprehensively so that you don't have to go back and read the newspapers again. I hope you guys benefit from this initiative, and if you do let us know by pressing the like button, share your comments, share the videos with other aspirants, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. And also please remember, as soon as the session ends, we have a quiz on our Telegram channel. So do head to the Telegram channel. The link is provided in the description box so you can take up these practice questions. So with this, let's begin with the discussion of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at this important column on page number 10. This article is written by Sunanda Sen, a retired professor from JNU. In this article, the writer is primarily talking about the increasing usage and adoption of the Indian rupee for settling international trade settlements. She is focusing upon the rising acceptance and adoption of the Indian rupee for cross-border international payments and trade settlements. This is a very significant trend that the writer is observing because according to the writer, this is the rise of the currencies of the South countries, that is the developing, underdeveloped countries. They are asserting themselves in the global economy, and at least some of the large developing economies like India, China, Brazil, and even Indonesia, right? They're all asserting themselves. They are agreeing for more settlements using their national currencies instead of relying on global reserve currencies such as the US dollar. I'm sure many of you know that the dollar is the most preferred reserve currency for settling trade payments and international payments. This has allowed the United States and other Western countries as well to dominate the global economy, and this of course has a geopolitical impact. The geo-economic influence gained through a currency status translates into geopolitical leverage as well. Now, the reason why United States and even European countries can dominate others, can impose economic sanctions on others, is because the global financial system is largely dominated by their currencies, which are the global reserve currencies. Even the euro, for that matter, is a widely adopted currency. Now, if you have ever wondered how come American sanctions on Iran or Russia or North Korea, how come they are so impactful? How come they can cripple those countries? And how come a country like India can never impose such sanctions on Pakistan? The answer is the global financial architecture is built on the US dollar. It's a dollar-based economy. And this essentially allows the US Federal Reserve, the US Treasury Department, the US State Department, and by extension the US government to exercise tremendous control over financial institutions and banks. And if required, they can cut off these targeted institutions from the dollar-based financial system. That is how they can cripple other countries and target few countries and impose these unilateral economic sanctions for geopolitical reasons. So the dominance of a country in geoeconomics through its reserve currency, through its globally adopted currency, gives it a tremendous geopolitical advantage as well. That is the reason why several countries from the global south, the developing countries like India, even Russia, China, Brazil, and others, they've always had issues with the economic policies of United States, the policies of global financial institutions like World Bank and IMF, because they're all Western dominated institutions relying on the US dollar and extending that hegemony which impacts the economy and sovereignty of other countries. But recently we have seen a trend where we are witnessing an increased adoption of the Indian rupee for international payments, for cross-border settlements. This is what the writer is focusing upon. The writer is pointing out that since March 2018, 23 advanced developed countries and as well as developing countries have signed currency swap agreements or arrangements with India. Essentially, they have agreed to extend credit or extend loans to India to settle transactions through a currency swap arrangement. Now, what's a currency swap arrangement? This could even be a prelims topic. A currency swap arrangement, as the name itself indicates, is an exchange of currency between two countries. Now, let's say, for example, India and Japan have a currency swap agreement. India wants to borrow some loan and Japan would extend this loan using a global reserve currency like the US dollar. The loan is provided through a foreign currency, let's say through the US dollar. Japan gives maybe $10 billion of loan to India in US dollars. Now India, which has received this currency in US dollars from Japan, can repay the loan either in Indian currency or in Japanese currency. The loan is repaid at a fixed date, at a predetermined exchange rate by using a different currency, by using Indian rupees or the Japanese currency. Such an arrangement of providing loans is called a currency swap arrangement, where the currencies are being swapped. The loan is provided in one currency and it's being repaid through another currency. Usually in such loans, the interest rate is very low. That is what attracts countries to go for currency swap arrangements. For example, India also has extended a currency swap arrangement to Sri Lanka to help Sri Lanka overcome its financial crisis. So India's RBI has provided financial support in the form of US dollars to Sri Lanka, and at a later date, Sri Lanka will repay the loan in Indian rupees or in Sri Lankan rupees. That is essentially a currency swap arrangement. So today many countries are more accepting of India. They are extending currency swap arrangements to India, which indicates the growing acceptance of the Indian rupee. That is, they are showing a willingness to accept payments in Indian rupee if required. This is also a recognition of India's growing market size and growing economic strength. That is why the writer is arguing that the increasing acceptance and adoption of the Indian rupee for international payments is a sign that currencies of the global south, they are asserting themselves. This could help in ending the hegemonic exploitative order and the dominance created by the currencies and economies of the north, the global north, that is the developed Western countries. That is the core argument being made by the writer in the article. Now let's go a little deep into this topic and let's understand how the US dollar came to become the reserve currency of the world. What's the history behind this? How come every country accepted US dollar as the global reserve currency? What led to that development? See, the US dollar was introduced quite recently. It was in the early 1900s that the US dollar was printed. Prior to that, in the US, financial transactions were carried out through bank notes that were issued individually by each bank. Is that clear? In the early 1900s, let's say around 1910, right? You didn't have the US dollar prior to that. Transactions were being settled within the US economy through bank notes that were printed by different banks. Each bank would have its own set of bank notes. In fact, there was no central bank in the US. The Federal Reserve didn't exist. So it was in 1913 that the Federal Reserve Act was passed in the US that led to the establishment of a central bank, which is called the Federal Reserve of the United States. The Federal Reserve started printing the greenback, which is a popular nickname for the US dollar. And this coincided with the rise of the United States as the world's largest economy. Right before the breakout of First World War, the United States had emerged as the world's largest economy by overtaking even the United Kingdom. Following this, we saw UK taking a massive economic hit because of the impact of the First World War. As the First World War was primarily centered around Europe, especially Western and Central Europe, the UK's economy took a massive hit, whereas US was establishing itself as a dominant large economy. So during this period of First World War, there were a lot of manipulations and volatility in the foreign exchange market when it came to settling international payments. When it came to settling trade payments, because of currency exchange issues and lack of stability with regard to exchange rates, many countries, especially European countries, were facing challenges with regard to their currency exchange. That is when the gold standard came to be adopted. As using foreign currencies for payments and cross-border payments was becoming problematic, gold standard became the accepted norm to pay for various transactions, to pay for imports and exports. By this time, United Kingdom and Europe, they started depending on the United States for war supplies. As US had become the largest economy, it had enough industries and factories to produce essential materials, goods and weapons, which it started supplying to allies, that is the UK and the other West European countries. So these countries, as they started importing more from the US, they had to pay the United States for the imports. And they started making the payments usually with gold. So US started accumulating more and more gold, which added strength to the US currency itself, because the US dollar was pegged to gold reserves of the United States. So at one point, the global reserve standard was the gold itself. Not any currency of any country, but gold itself was a standard, a global reserve currency of sorts to settle international payments. But slowly, US started accumulating massive quantities of gold as European countries started procuring war supplies and they paid US in gold. And as the dollar was pegged to the gold, the dollar's value kept rising, kept increasing. Then came a point where European countries abandoned the gold standard. It wasn't viable for them anymore. They abandoned the gold standard. By then, US witnessed the Great Economic Depression as well. But despite the economic crisis in the US economy bounced back by the time of the Second World War. So during Second World War as well, European countries heavily depended on the US economy for essential war supplies. So again, the European countries started paying for American imports through gold, and the US Federal Reserve kept accumulating gold, thus increasing the value of the US dollar. After the Second World War came to an end, by then gold standard had been abandoned. The US dollar was clearly the strongest currency, and through the Bretton Woods Conference, which led to the establishment of your World Bank and IMF, the US was more or less accepted as the global reserve currency. As the US economy was stable and it was the largest economy, and the US held the largest gold reserves because of all the gold supplies that had come from Europe. And since US dollar itself was pegged to its gold reserves, the US dollar eventually became the global reserve currency following the Second World War. In fact, countries around the world, including European countries, they started accumulating reserves of US dollars. They started building their foreign exchange reserves by accumulating US dollars instead of the gold reserves, because gold had been abandoned as a standard. They started purchasing US Treasury securities as well as a safe store of money. And by 1970s, by 1971, when the oil crisis hit the world, by then US dollar had firmly established itself as the most preferred global reserve currency. The reason why the US dollar has been accepted as a global reserve currency is primarily because of its stability. The stability of the US economy, the gold reserves of the US to which the US dollar is pegged, and the limited fluctuations in the value of the US dollar. Right? The US dollar is able to maintain a steady price level with minimal fluctuations because of the stability of the American economy. So this has allowed the United States to dominate the global economy, and this of course turns into geopolitical advantages as well. Now if you look at even euro, the currency of the European Union, right? Some of the EU countries have accepted euro as their currency. Even euro is a very widely accepted global reserve currency today. So these Western countries, as their economies stabilized, their currencies gained value, became stable currencies, they became more widely adopted as global reserve currencies. And the financial architecture of the world, which is largely determined by the World Bank and the IMF, they are dominated by Western countries. They are dominated by US and European Union countries. So as a result, the global economy has largely depended on US dollar, euro and other such currencies, which gives their respective central banks and governments tremendous control over the economy, and that is why they can punish other countries with crippling economic sanctions. I've seen that in class, many students ask me this question: how come US sanctions are so effective? Why can't India impose such sanctions? The reason why India can never impose such effective sanctions as of now is because the Indian rupee is not widely accepted. It will not cripple any other country. It will not affect the financial flows to another target country. If US were to do that against a target country, it will cripple the flow of US dollars. It will affect the trade settlements of that country, thereby crippling the economy of the target nation. That's why Iran, North Korea, Russia, they're struggling under the impact of American sanctions. So now that you have understood this link, it's very, very important to examine the recent changes that are taking place with regard to the Indian rupee. In the last few years, the Indian rupee is being more widely accepted as a currency for trade settlements, at least bilaterally between certain countries. The trend has increased following the breakout of the Russia-Ukraine war and the Western sanctions that have been imposed on Russia. As you know, India does not follow unilateral sanctions. We don't abide by sanctions imposed by one country or few countries, because Indian foreign policy is based on the principle of strategic autonomy. We follow an independent foreign policy. So in most cases, generally, we don't follow unilateral sanctions imposed by few countries. So India bypassed the Western sanctions and continued its close relations with Russia. Russia is also a strategic partner to India. So India bypassed the sanctions and stepped up its strategic economic relationship with Russia, and we started procuring Russian discounted oil as it was available at a cheaper cost to strengthen Indian energy security. We purchased a lot of Russian oil in the last 1.5 years, and India owed a lot of payments to Russia. We owed around $42 billion in payments as Russia became the second largest oil supplier to India. So now the challenge was, how will India pay for these Russian oil imports? This was the question. So what India and Russia did was they worked out an alternate payment route. They worked out an alternate payment route using the Indian rupee for settling the transaction. Russia accepted this alternate payment for at least some time. So to facilitate rupee-based payments, Vostro accounts were opened in Russian banks. Essentially, Indian banks will open an account in Russian banks, which is called a Vostro account, and Indian dealers, Indian traders, for example, those who are purchasing oil from Russia, they will make payments in Indian rupees into this Vostro account. In return, other Russian companies which want to purchase something from the Indian market, they will use the same Indian rupees deposited in the Vostro account to purchase what they want from the Indian market. Because see, Indian rupee cannot be used like other reserve currencies in the global market. The reason is the Indian currency is not fully convertible. It's only partially convertible, right? So Indian currency has no value outside of India. So to overcome this disadvantage, Vostro accounts are needed, where a country agrees to settle payments in local currency like the Indian rupee, and in return, the Russian companies can make use of the Indian rupee deposited in the Vostro account to procure items, goods from the Indian market by paying for the transactions in Indian rupees itself. This arrangement will work very well only when both the sides are having a very strong trading relationship. There should be a balanced trade relationship, meaning India should also have a lot of imports from Russia, and Russia should also be looking at a lot of imports from India, right? It is very essential to achieve the trade balance. But here a problem came up. A problem came up because Russia doesn't procure much from the Indian market. Now what will Russia do with all the Indian rupees that is accumulating in the Vostro account? Nearly $42 billion worth of money was paid by India in Indian rupees. And Russia has no need for such a large sum of Indian rupees because Russia doesn't purchase much from India. Indian exports to Russia is very limited. That is when Russia started complaining. Russia raised an issue that these rupees are useless for us. To a point, we can purchase something from the Indian market, but beyond that, we don't need anything else. And the money lies idle in the account as Indian rupees are useless for Russia outside of India. In fact, a similar arrangement had been worked out between India and Iran a few years back. Between 2008 to 2012, when Iran was hit with American sanctions targeting its nuclear weapons program, the then Manmohan Singh government, in order to preserve the strategic relations with Iran, bypassed the American sanctions and continued importing oil and gas from Iran by making rupee-based payments to Iranian companies. Similar Vostro accounts were set up where rupees would be deposited in these banks by Indian importers, and in return, Iranian government and Iranian companies, they could use the Indian rupees to purchase what they wanted in the Indian market. This arrangement worked quite well because Iran did have a requirement to procure from the Indian market. The trade balance was there, so Iran could make use of the Indian rupees and purchase what it wanted from the Indian market. But Russia's case is different. Russia has no such requirement, and as a result, Russia was reluctant to hold more rupees after a certain point. So then India had to explore other options. Instead of Indian rupees, we had to find out other currencies through which we can continue paying for Russian oil. US dollar and euro was out of the question because they were the ones who had imposed sanctions on Russia, US and European countries. So there was no way we can use dollar or euro to pay for the payments, as that would be hit by the impact of their sanctions. So the only viable alternative for India was the Chinese yuan. This was one option for the time being. So for the short term, India made some payments using the Chinese yuan, but again, this is a dependency for India. India was worried about using the Chinese yuan because of strategic reasons. As you know, China has been very aggressive against India and the border tensions have gone up. And China is known to leverage any dependency, any economic dependency, to gain a strategic leverage over the other country. China is known to do that. It uses its economic advantage over other countries to gain a geopolitical advantage. So India wanted to move away from its dependency on Chinese yuan as well, because this was not a reliable option for India. So this is where India worked out a unique arrangement with the United Arab Emirates. India and UAE have recently signed a historic agreement to set up a rupee dirham based transaction. That is, India and UAE will settle their transactions, their trade and international payments by using a rupee to dirham transaction. That is, Indian traders and traders on the side of the UAE will settle their payments using Indian rupees and UAE's dirham. And UAE's dirham is acceptable to Russia. UAE's dirham is more acceptable to Russia, as Russia can make use of UAE's dirham to purchase what it wants from the United Arab Emirates. So Indian oil importers started making these payments using UAE's currency as an alternate currency to reduce our dependency on the Chinese yuan. So what the writer is trying to tell us is that this is not the first time we have worked out such payment arrangements, which points towards the internationalization of the Indian rupee. It also indicates a de-dollarization of the economy. The growing significance of local currencies from developing countries is a trend that you need to observe. The rising influence of local currencies like Indian rupee, Chinese yuan, UAE dirham, Indonesia's rupiah, right? This is a very important trend as it points to the declining influence of the US dollar. Even in the past, we have examples for this. During the Cold War period, between 1950s to 1990s, even then India had worked out similar arrangements with the Soviet Union and other countries aligned with the Soviet bloc. Even then, the Western countries were targeting Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc countries, but India was very close to Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc countries. So to continue our trade with these countries, from 1950s itself, the then Nehru government had initiated alternate payment arrangements by using Indian rupee or other alternate currencies. So this is nothing new to India. Now the difference is that India is building upon this, and we are working towards building a new financial architecture with other countries. India, Brazil, UAE, Russia, Indonesia, even China is seen as part of this arrangement, where these countries are seeking alternate payment systems to reduce their dependency on the US dollar. Is that clear? So this rupee dirham arrangement which has been created helps in settling all transactions, trade transactions, even remittance flows from UAE to India, and investment flows, capital flows between the two countries. So foreign investment between two countries can be settled using rupee dirham arrangement instead of depending on the US dollar. Remittance flow is very, very important because UAE is home to a very large Indian community. There are 3.5 million Indians residing and working in the United Arab Emirates, and they are part of inward flow of remittances into India, which is crucial for the Indian economy, right? So it will help the Indian community as well in providing quick and cheap and cost-effective transaction options. So that is why India is pursuing such agreements with many other countries as well. Bilaterally, we are working out these trade arrangements where we can use our local currencies to reduce our dependency on the dollar. Is that clear? And we are following this pattern with other countries as well. Recently, India has signed a similar agreement with Sri Lanka. India and Sri Lanka have agreed to use the Indian rupee and the Sri Lankan rupee for their bilateral transactions instead of using the US dollar. We are negotiating a similar agreement with Indonesia as well to work out a rupee-rupaya trading arrangement. Is that clear? So this points towards the growing internationalization of the Indian rupee and the growing adoption and acceptance of the Indian rupee. This, along with the growing adoption of UPI, the Unified Payments Interface, gives India the right foothold to promote the usage of rupee for settling bilateral trade transactions, for settling remittance flows, for settling capital flow transactions. And this essentially reduces our dependency on the US dollar and the Western economies. So based on this observation, the writer concludes by saying that India, Russia, China, UAE, Indonesia, they're all giving preference to promote local currency transactions, and this is a positive sign for the global South countries. It is a positive sign for developing nations because it means that they are looking to reduce their dependency on the US dollar. It could lead to de-dollarization of the economy in the coming years, and this could have a geopolitical impact as well. Because until now, in the last 70 odd years, US and West Europe, they have dominated the global economy and global geopolitics, primarily because of their control over global reserve currencies. Going forward, if the dollar were to lose its prominence, and if local currencies were to gain more prominence like the Indian rupee or UAE's dirham, etc., this would allow global South countries to counter the dominance of the global North and even overcome the challenges posed by IMF and World Bank, which are Western dominated financial institutions. We might very well witness the rise of a new financial architecture led by developing countries through their local currencies. So this is the important argument that the writer is making in this column, and it's a very important topic not just for international relations but also for Indian economy. So let's move on to the next article. On the same page, we have an article written by Pradeep and Indranil Mukhyopadhyay, where they are focusing on the impact of climate change on urban settlements. The focus of the article is on the impact of climate change on urban settlements and how the poor people in urban areas are the most vulnerable with regard to the impact of climate change. So let's look at what the writers are pointing out. The writers are taking the examples of some of the latest disasters that have occurred in India and around the world. They're referring to Cyclone Biparjoy that caused a lot of devastation in Gujarat and other western parts of India. They're referring to various floods, cyclones, landslides and droughts and heat waves and forest fires And all these are essentially extreme weather events, which apparently is being driven by climate change and global warming. According to available scientific evidence, we are more likely to witness such extreme weather events with greater frequency and greater magnitude around the world. So as a result, the writers are saying that with increased number of disasters and with increasing magnitude of disasters, disease vulnerability also increases. For example, when there are floods, droughts, cyclones, etc., it's more easier for contagious diseases to spread following the disaster. This is one instance they are taking based on recent research that the writers were involved in. They're pointing out that how after a flood, the stagnant water becomes a breeding ground for various pathogens, for bacteria, viruses, and vector-borne diseases. They start spreading quite rapidly following such disasters. For example, regions which are affected by floods, they witness an outbreak of malaria following the disaster. They could even witness a breakout of cholera, which is a waterborne disease. So such contagious infectious diseases could break out and spread, which affects the victims, right? And it essentially becomes like a secondary disaster after having suffered from the impact of a natural disaster. So this is the connection they are highlighting, that natural disasters, right, they have gone up in their frequency and magnitude because of climate change and global warming, and disasters like floods, droughts, etc., they directly contribute to increased disease vulnerability. Even droughts will contribute to more diseases, because when you have a drought, there is water scarcity. In whatever water pools that remain, the water would largely be stagnant, and it becomes a breeding ground for pathogens, a breeding ground for various vectors that carry the disease, such as mosquitoes, for example. So regions that suffer from such disasters, they quite often witness the breakout of deadly infectious diseases, including malaria, dengue, chikungunya, cholera, and many other diseases. So here the writer's concern is primarily about urban areas which are densely populated. Urban settlements are perfect for the spread of such infectious diseases. Now today we are witnessing more urban flooding incidents. Several cities are being badly hit by disasters. So they are pointing out the concern for the poor population in urban settlements, especially for slums. They're pointing out how poverty, poor sanitation and hygiene, and the lack of quality health care makes the poor people in cities the most vulnerable for the impact of these diseases following natural disasters. Is that clear? Their essential argument is that rising extreme weather events will disproportionately affect the poor population in cities in the coming years. They are identifying urban slums and the urban poor as the most vulnerable community as far as the impact of such diseases are concerned. Vector-borne diseases, contagious diseases will affect the poor population more in the cities, and also because of the dense population, the diseases will spread very easily, and it has a huge impact, a devastating impact on these families. When poor families are affected by such diseases, it creates a vicious cycle of poverty. Those families are further pushed into poverty because of disease, increased expenditure on healthcare. So that is why they are urging governments to plan, to prepare, and focus on creating resilient primary healthcare infrastructure in cities, which could help out the urban poor. This is the primary argument being made by the writers in this column. Is that clear? They are calling upon governments at the national level, at the state level, and the local level to focus on creating a resilient primary healthcare infrastructure, which is led by the government. They're calling for strengthening of public health institutions in cities, which should focus on helping out the urban poor, especially urban population that resides in urban slums. Is that clear? So this is the key point you have to take away from this column on page number 10. Now let's take up the next article from page number 11. which focuses on the CHIPS Act of the United States. The CHIPS Act of the US was adopted last year. It's been 1 year since this legislation was enacted and implemented. The CHIPS Act, as the name itself indicates, it promotes the semiconductor industry in the United States. The prime goal and focus of this act is to promote research, innovation, manufacturing, and the entire processing chain in the semiconductor industry. Because semiconductors are of great economic and strategic significance. There is not a single industry where semiconductors are not used. So as a result, semiconductors have great economic significance. And because of their application in defense, aerospace, etc., they have a strategic value as well. And very few countries control the semiconductor supply chains. Few countries like China, then few regions like Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, they are traditionally seen as global leaders when it comes to the semiconductor industry. Of course, US is also a major semiconductor producing nation, but US is trying to reduce its dependency on importing semiconductors from rivals like China. It wants to diversify the supply chain and build domestic resilience when it comes to semiconductor research, innovation, and production. That is why this act was enacted in the United States. It stands for Creating Helpful Incentives to Produce Semiconductors and Science Act of 2022. Now you might ask, how is this topic relevant for UPSC exams? According to the writer, we can draw crucial lessons from this law and how it is being implemented in the US and adopt that in India. Because even India is trying to achieve self-reliance as far as semiconductors are concerned. India is heavily import dependent with regard to semiconductors. We have a lot of import dependency. We barely have any semiconductor fabrication or chip fabrication happening in India. We have very, very limited research in this domain, right? Even with regard to manufacturing and the entire process chain, India is way behind the curve compared to other countries. So we end up importing critical semiconductors, which is the backbone of our economy and national security, from countries like China, which could even pose a national security risk. We are heavily dependent on other suppliers, including Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan, and this is a critical weakness in the Indian economy. So India is also setting out a path to become self-reliant or Atmanirbhar with regard to semiconductor fabrication. India also has many initiatives in this regard, and that's why the writer is pointing out that we can draw lessons from the CHIPS Act of the US and we can try to implement some of the model in India. Is that clear? Under the CHIPS Act, the US has set aside around $52.7 billion to support the semiconductor industry over the next 5 years. The American objective is to increase focus on research and innovation, promote competitiveness within the US economy in the semiconductor sector, and also achieve national security goals by becoming independent and self-reliant with regard to semiconductors. This will reduce American dependency on China-dominated supply chains. It serves a national security purpose as well. So India shares a similar vision, and obviously our interests align together. So we can draw lessons from this American experience. We can observe what US is doing, how it is working in the US. We can look at their implementation model and draw some lessons that we can implement in the domestic context that could ensure the success of our own initiatives and schemes, which is focused on the semiconductor industry. The writer says that the most important lesson we have to take away from the CHIPS Act of the US is that the US has provided for very efficient cooperation and coordination between different organs of the US government when it comes to implementing this initiative by establishing 4 separate funds. The $52.7 billion which has been set aside as investment and incentives for the industry, this is divided into 4 separate funds managed by 4 different government entities of the US government. See, when it comes to semiconductors, there are different parts of the government which are involved in this industry. In the US, you have the Department of Commerce, which primarily drives industrial semiconductor manufacturing and production. You also have the Department of Defense, the State Department, and other institutions of the US government which are involved in semiconductor research, manufacturing, and production. US also has a dedicated fund called National Science Foundation through which it funds research projects. So there are different government entities and all of them have been assigned separate funds and they coordinate and cooperate with each other to achieve an efficient working model at the national level. Even though there are different arms of the US government working towards the same goal, there is no confusion between them. There is no overlap in what they are doing. They're not wasting the funds, they're not wasting the resources. Instead, they're pooling their resources together, coordinating with each other and working towards a common vision. This has been enabled by the CHIPS Act of the US. The Act provides for clear demarcation of what is the role of Department of Commerce, what is the role of Department of Defense, the role of National Science Foundation, the role of Department of State, how the funds allocated to them should be utilized. This is exactly what India should learn from. Because even in India, we have different organs of the government focusing on semiconductor research and manufacturing. The lead ministry is the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology. It has already come out with a semiconductor industrial policy for the country. Along with Ministry of Electronics and IT, we have other initiatives. We have many other measures taken up to promote semiconductor research and manufacturing. So we also have to ensure coordination between these different organs of the Indian government. We have the India Semiconductor Mission to focus on manufacturing, assembly, displays and compound semiconductors, which is like an independent division functioning under a non-profit company set up under the Ministry of Electronics and IT. While Ministry of Electronics and IT is the nodal ministry for the industrial policy, under the ministry itself there is a non-profit company under which India Semiconductor Mission is being run separately and parallelly. Then we have a policy for chip design, which is implemented by CDAC, which focuses on research and development. CDAC is the Center for Advanced Computing, right, which specializes in supercomputers, in chip research, etc. So it has a separate policy for chip design, which is focused only on research and development. Whereas India Semiconductor Mission is only focused on manufacturing assembly. So this is the different focus we are paying to different steps involved in the semiconductor manufacturing chain. Now the focus for India should be to bring all these together and achieve the required coordination between different entities and different schemes and incentives which are being implemented. We also have the National Semiconductor Technology Center, and its focus is to promote collaboration between the semiconductor industry, the electronics industry and educational institutions in order to bring research from universities directly into the industry and to share industry expertise with college students and university students. Also to raise the required workforce we need, the trained professional workforce that we need. There's another program called Chips to Startup, C2S program, being implemented in 100 universities and colleges to promote training and create the required workforce for the country. So we have so many parallel programs and initiatives going on which are administered by different organs of the Indian government. You have Ministry of Electronics and IT running the industrial policy. You have CDAC running the research program on chip design. You have India Semiconductor Mission focusing only on manufacturing. You have National Semiconductor Technology Center that's bringing the industry together with the educational institutions. We have Chips to Startup program, C2S program, focusing on universities, bringing ideas into the industry and trying to set up a startup model and trying to train and raise the workforce that we need. So what we have to do is ensure that there is cooperation and coordination between all these institutions and the programs that they are running. This is where we draw a key lesson from the CHIPS Act of the US. We have to define priority areas under our semiconductor industrial policy. In the CHIPS Act, the priorities are very clearly defined. The focus on research, the focus on chip fabrication, the focus on packaging a chip, all the stages of the semiconductor cycle is covered under the CHIPS Act and the priorities are allocated, the responsibilities are assigned, and accordingly funds are assigned to them. Now, if India also can do the same, which can suit the Indian context, then this would ensure the success of India's semiconductor mission. Is that clear? We need to streamline the different initiatives that we have. Even we have to invest in research and future technologies. We can't just focus on semiconductor manufacturing. We have to invest in research and development. Focus on other aspects of semiconductor design, which includes semiconductor packaging, which currently is not a priority in India. We have to give priority to the entire life cycle of semiconductor research and manufacturing, and that is what we should define as well. And these are some key lessons we can draw from the CHIPS Act of the United States. So please note down these key points being raised by the author, because you can expect questions. The topic is very important for economy and also for international relations, even for science and technology, right? Now let's take up the last mains article from page number 8 that's related to social issues and social justice. This article is referring to a recent case in the Kerala State High Court regarding an intersex baby that was born. To understand the article, first you should understand what is intersex or who is an intersex person. Based on that, I'll explain the issue concerned and what the High Court has observed. Alright? First, let's understand what does intersex mean. Intersex people, they belong to a gender minority, like transgenders, gays, lesbians, etc. Intersex people, they belong to gender minority. They are a part of gender minority. See, generally, in a traditional society, gender is assigned in binaries as male or female. But there are many other possibilities as well, which are natural occurrences, natural variations. So they fall under gender minority. Intersex refers to a kid or a baby which is born with a certain defect as far as its genitalia is concerned or its hormonal composition is concerned. Usually in an intersex baby which is born, the genitalia, the external genitalia based on which we assign binary genders like male or female, is not clearly developed. So since the external genitalia is not clearly developed, the sexual anatomy is not regular, there could also be hormonal imbalance involved as well. So essentially it is difficult to assign a particular gender or a sex to such a child which is intersex, whose external genitalia is not clearly developed. So regular binary genders cannot be assigned. So generally what is done is that the parents along with the doctors, they decide the gender and perform a surgery. On these babies, surgery is performed to assign a particular gender as either male or female, and accordingly the genitalia is reconstructed. The doctors perform a reconstruction surgery to reconstruct the abnormally formed external genitalia and assign a particular gender to that baby. Now the question here is, can parents or can doctors decide the gender identity of a person? Of course, the baby, the infant, is in no position to decide what gender it wants to assign with. Please remember, intersex people, there is no guarantee that the baby will grow up to associate with the same gender identity which has been assigned at birth. Now take for example, an intersex baby has been born. Parents and doctors decide that they have to assign male as the gender, and accordingly the genitalia would be reconstructed through a surgery and the kid is classified as a male. But after growing up in its teenage years or in adulthood, it will realize that the kid or the person, they don't associate with male anatomy, with male physiology. They would be inclined towards the other gender. That's a natural inclination that comes up. So if gender is assigned, a binary gender is assigned at birth itself, then is this not a breach, a violation of the right of the person to choose their gender? This is where right to gender identity comes up. Is that clear? The Supreme Court of India has passed a very, very important ruling in this regard. You might have heard about the Nalsa judgment of 2014. In the landmark Nalsa case in 2014, the Supreme Court ruled that every individual has a right to gender identity, which means gender association should be the choice of that person, of that individual. Your parents, your family, your society, your government or courts or even doctors, they cannot tell you what gender you associate with. Gender identity is self-association. It should come with one's choice. And this is what the Supreme Court clearly recognized as a right under the Transgender Protection Act. Is that clear? Because in the case of intersex people, there is no guarantee that even after genitalia reconstruction surgery and assigning of a binary gender, there is no guarantee that the person will grow up to associate with that assigned gender. Later, they might start associating with the opposite gender, which puts them under tremendous emotional and psychological trauma and distress. So that is why the courts are very, very clear that one should not interfere with the gender identity of a person. Now here, coming back to the case in Kerala, an intersex baby has been born and the parents and doctors are pushing for a genitalia reconstruction surgery to assign a gender to the baby. The case has reached the Kerala High Court and the Kerala High Court has put a stop on this surgery. The Kerala High Court has said, we will not give you permission to conduct the reconstructive surgery. It has said we will set up a committee. It has directed the state government to immediately set up a committee comprising of a pediatrician, endocrinologist, a pediatric surgeon and a child psychiatrist to decide on the case, and it has urged the government to issue guidelines in this regard. The government has been asked by the High Court to come out with guidelines as per the provisions of Transgender Persons Protection of Rights Act. Because under this law, the definition of gender minorities has been provided. Definition of transgenders, intersex people has been provided. And the law clearly recognizes that the right to self-identify one's gender is a guaranteed right under Section 4 Clause 2 of the Transgender Protection Act. In the Nalsa judgment as well, the Supreme Court upheld this. It has ruled that every person has a basic right to choose their gender, to associate themselves with the right gender. This can't be enforced at birth, especially for intersex people, by parents or by court or by the doctors. Right? So this is a very, very important judgment that the Kerala High Court has passed. It has pushed the government to come out with norms and guidelines, and this could further push up the debate regarding one's gender identity. Alright, so that is the key point I wanted to highlight, and this brings my detailed discussion of all the mains articles to an end. Now let's proceed to the prelims section. We have 6 small articles. We can quickly go through them one by one. On page number 1, we have an article that refers to the no confidence motion that was pushed by the opposition parties against the Modi government. I'm sure all of you would have read in newspapers that opposition parties, they've expressed a no confidence in the current ruling government, particularly on the Manipur issue, on the scale of violence that Manipur has witnessed and the failure of the government to prevent it. So they pushed for a no confidence motion which was accepted by the Speaker of the Lok Sabha. Of course, this no confidence motion will have no impact on the stability of the Modi government, because the current central government has enough numbers in the parliament to win the no confidence vote. But opposition parties, of course, they know that, but they still wanted to push a no confidence motion as it allows them an opportunity to debate on key issues, to hold the government accountable. Right? Of course, the opposition knows that ruling party has enough numbers. There's no way that the government can be brought down. It's impossible. But still, it gives an opportunity for the opposition to question the government on the floor of the House and express the lack of confidence of the opposition parties in the current ruling dispensation. In this context, you should know some basic details about no confidence motion, which is very, very important for your prelims. No confidence motion is basically a formal procedure that is available only in the Lok Sabha. Please note down the point. It's not available in the Rajya Sabha. Why? Because According to Article 75 of the Indian Constitution, the Council of Ministers headed by the Prime Minister, they are accountable to the Lok Sabha. Correct? The Council of Ministers and the PM, they are answerable to the elected representatives in the Lok Sabha, according to Article 75. So, Council of Ministers will remain in power, including the Prime Minister, only when they have the full confidence of the Parliament, majority confidence of the Parliament. That is why no confidence motion is an option for opposition parties to express the lack of confidence of the House of the Lok Sabha in the Council of Ministers. This is mentioned under Rule 198 of Rules of Procedure and Conduct of Business in the Lok Sabha. And if this motion is passed, right, there will be voting. In no confidence motion, voting takes place at the end of the debate. First, all the key issues are brought up, the issues are discussed, the opposition raises its allegations against the ruling government, they tell why they don't have confidence in the government, and the motion is put to vote. If the motion passes, that is if opposition has enough numbers, and if they can vote in favor of no confidence motion, it means that Lok Sabha has lost confidence in the Council of Ministers. And it means the Council of Ministers have to step down, right? The Prime Minister of the Council of Ministers have to resign, and that marks the fall of the government. Of course, in the current case, it will not happen because the ruling party has enough numbers in the Parliament. Now, to accept this motion, there is a condition. If the Speaker of Lok Sabha has to accept the no confidence motion, the condition according to Rule 198 of the Rule of Procedure is that the no confidence motion should be supported by at least 50 members of the Lok Sabha. At least 50 MPs in Lok Sabha have to support the adoption of the motion. Only then the Speaker will consider and adopt the motion, following which a date is set for the debate. The government should answer all the queries and questions, following which the motion is put to vote. Depending on the vote, the future of the government is decided. Is that clear? If the government doesn't get enough numbers, government will fall. The Council of Ministers have to resign because it means that Lok Sabha has lost confidence in the Council of Ministers. Is that clear? Because according to Article 75, Council of Ministers are accountable to the Lok Sabha. So this is the importance of no confidence motion. Next, on page 16, we have this article according to which a parliamentary committee on women empowerment has studied the health status of tribal women. Is that clear? A parliamentary standing committee on women empowerment has studied the health status of tribal women in the country, and it has expressed a concern that there isn't enough data available regarding the health condition of tribal women in the country. Because tribal communities are quite vulnerable to various diseases and genetic disorders. Is that clear? So the parliamentary committee has pointed out to the union government that the government hasn't collected enough data, specific disaggregated data on different health conditions and genetic disorders. And as a result, we are not able to understand the full impact of these diseases on the tribal communities, particularly on tribal women. That's why the committee has directed the Tribal Affairs Ministry to deploy resources that are needed to improve the health and education standards of tribal communities in the country. Is that clear? So while making these observations, the parliamentary committee has observed some concerns regarding few disorders and diseases that affects our tribal communities. They have made a mention of sickle-cell disease and G6PD deficiency, along with other disorders. Tribal communities in India, they suffer from various diseases including leprosy, sickle-cell anemia, tuberculosis, cholera, and other communicable infectious diseases. Along with that, they also suffer from genetic disorders such as sickle-cell disease and G6PD deficiency. So I think from this article, there are two topics we can take away for prelims. We have to study these genetic disorders, understand what they are, just the basics. The first one is sickle-cell disorder. Let's see what is it. In sickle-cell disorder, it's essentially a chronic condition and it's a result of a genetic disorder. It is a genetic disorder which is hereditary, and those who suffer from sickle cell disorder, you will see that the RBCs, the red blood cells, they would have been taken the wrong shape. They look like a sickle, like a crescent. That's why it's called sickle cell disorder, right? RBCs are generally oval shaped. But because of this genetic disorder, there is abnormal development of the red blood cells where the RBC acquires the shape of a sickle or a crescent, and hence this disorder is called sickle cell disorder. It can cause sickle cell anemia because when RBCs are misshaped, right, they easily break down and it affects the oxygen carrying capacity and affects hemoglobin levels, causing sickle cell anemia. The dysfunctional red blood cells will lead to abnormal hemoglobin levels and also affects the oxygen carrying capacity to all the tissues and organs. This is a very dangerous condition, a deadly condition. Those suffering from sickle cell disorder can suffer from sickle cell anemia, and they can also witness intense body pain. They will suffer from sudden bursts of pain in different parts of the body. They also suffer from severe psychological distress as well, and there is no cure for the disease. Treatments are available to relieve the pain and the complications, but you don't have a permanent cure for the genetic disorder. And sickle cell disorders are quite highly prevalent amongst tribal communities. It's largely because of their genetic makeup. As I told you, it's a hereditary disorder that's passed down generations because of abnormality in the genetic sequence. Is that clear? So this is a major concern, and sickle cell anemia, which affects tribal women, is particularly of concern as far as tribal health and women health is concerned. Another type of genetic disorder which affects tribal communities is G6PD. The G6PD deficiency. G6PD deficiency. It stands for glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase deficiency. It's a type of deficiency that affects RBCs again, and it is a genetic disorder. It's an inherited genetic disorder affecting the red blood cells. So those who suffer from this, they have a defect in an enzyme, a critical enzyme for RBCs called G6PD. That is glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase. This is a key enzyme, and because of the defect, it causes the RBCs to break down prematurely. Is that clear? RBCs keep breaking up prematurely, causing a condition known as hemolysis. Hemolysis is quite dangerous as it leads to anemia, jaundice, and affects children and women. And tribal communities again report a higher incidence of this disorder because of their genetic makeup and genetic composition. Is that clear? So they suffer from various symptoms as well, including fatigue, shortness of breath, rapid heart rate, and affects their day-to-day functioning and overall health care. So that is why the Parliamentary Committee has expressed concern that the Tribal Affairs Ministry, the Ministry of Family Health and Welfare, they don't have sufficient data on the extent of impact of these genetic disorders on our tribal population. That's why the Standing Committee has asked the Tribal Affairs Ministry to collect such data and to strengthen measures to improve healthcare and education standards for the tribal community. Alright, so please note down these two diseases, they can be important for your prelims. Next, on page 18 under the economy section, the article refers to something known as medium term expenditure framework under the FRBM Act. FRBM stands for Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act. This act mandates the union government to stick to its fiscal deficit. Fiscal deficit targets are laid and ensures that the country does not witness a fiscal crisis, and mandates the government to be responsible in its fiscal management. Is that clear? So under FRBM, fiscal deficit targets are laid out for the government, and the government cannot breach the target unless and until there are extraordinary circumstances. Fiscal deficit is all about the difference between the revenue and the expenditure of the government. If revenues are low and expenditure is high, obviously there will be a fiscal deficit, which is nothing but your budgetary deficit. So to keep the government spending under check and to maintain the fiscal health of the economy, FRBM Act was enacted that mandates fiscal deficit targets and mandates the government to follow few fiscal responsible measures. One of the measures needed under FRBM Act is to bring out a medium-term expenditure framework. It is a 3-year framework which is given by the government that gives an idea about government's expenditure, government's revenue. It gives us a picture where the government stands with regard to maintaining fiscal responsibility and achieving the fiscal deficit targets. Is that clear? So usually after the budget is presented, in the next session, that is the monsoon session, the government is mandated legally to produce this framework in the parliament, to table the medium-term expenditure framework in the parliament. But in the current monsoon session, the government has said we are not able to table the framework. The government is not bringing out the medium-term expenditure framework because of exceptional global circumstances. As you know, there is a recession tendency in the global economy. The Russia-Ukraine war, the increasing interest rates in the US, they're all adverse developments for the Indian economy. So the government has to keep its ability to spend more if required to give a boost to the domestic economy. If global economy is falling into recession, to sustain the domestic demand, government expenditure has to increase. Government will have to give more incentives, provide for more expenditure, invest on capital assets to boost economic growth. So under such exceptional circumstances, governments can breach fiscal deficit targets. For example, when 2009 recession happened, when COVID-19 pandemic happened, the governments breached the fiscal deficit targets mandated through FRBM Act in order to support the economy, because these were exceptional, extraordinary circumstances. So the government has said we are not bringing out medium-term expenditure framework because we want our weapons to be ready. When I say weapon, I mean money. I mean the expenditure of the government, which is a key weapon to fight recession and downturn in the economy. Right? In finance terms, money is a weapon in the hands of the government. It's a tool through which it can revive the economy and boost growth and sustain growth. So the government has said to effectively manage the economy in this difficult time, the government needs more flexibility, and if required, it may have to breach fiscal deficit target, and that is why it has not brought out the expenditure framework. Is that clear? So please note down what is medium-term expenditure framework. It is a legally mandated framework that the government has to present in front of the parliament according to section 3 of FRBM Act. It basically contains a list of government expenditures, where the government stands on its expenditure and revenue. So it has to list out all the expenditure, revenue receipts. It has to list out the interest payments, right? The dues which are pending, the investments on capital assets. So all these accounts have to be presented in the medium-term expenditure framework, which gives us an idea about the liabilities of the government and the revenue stream of the government. So the parliament will get to know as to where we stand regarding our fiscal deficit, whether we'll achieve our fiscal deficit target or not. It's like a mid-review, right? It's like a mid-year review. It's an update from the government regarding where we stand on expenditure and revenue. Understood? So please make a note of this. It could be relevant for your prelims. Next, on the last page, on page 22 of the online edition, there is an image that the Hindu carries. In the image, you can see few trucks that are dumping hot slag in Indonesia. The slag that they are dumping here is a byproduct of nickel production. I hope you know that nickel is a very, very critical metal, especially for batteries used in electric vehicles. Nickel has already become a critical mineral given that the world is transitioning towards electric vehicles and battery storage that stores energy from renewable sources. Just like lithium, nickel is also a critical resource to transition towards battery storage and electric vehicles. And guess which country has the world's largest nickel reserves? It is Indonesia. Please remember this point, a very, very important fact. Indonesia is blessed with the world's largest reserves of nickel, and it provides nearly 50% of the global supply. Almost 50% of the world's nickel supply comes from Indonesia. Also take a look at this table I have added. Please note down the top 3 producers of nickel. Indonesia, Philippines and Russia, in this order. these are the top 3 nickel producing countries in the world. Alright, very, very important fact for your prelims. The last article on the same page, the Hindu carries a question regarding why gravel is added on railway tracks. I'm sure you would have noticed on railway tracks, right? The Indian railways would have used gravel or these small stones that are laid below the railway track. Now, what is the purpose? Do the gravel serve any scientific purpose, or are they simply using gravel? That is the question the article is answering. The gravel used actually serves a very, very important purpose because it is acting as a dampener. It's like a cushion on which the railway track is laid. The gravel absorbs the vibration, the strong high intensity vibrations that come out when a train passes on the track. These vibrations are absorbed and dampened by the gravel that is laid below the track and around the track. Or else these vibrations could travel through the ground and affect nearby buildings. It could affect the very alignment of the railway track itself. The railway track could lose alignment and the vibrations could travel and affect nearby buildings. So to absorb the vibrations like a ballast and also to divert water flow when there is heavy rainfall, right? The water flow also has to be managed. So this is where the gravel plays a role. It adds stability to the rail structure, acts like a cushion or a dampener absorbing the vibrations, and provides a ballast for water flow as well. So that is the key purpose of adding gravel. It's not added without a reason. There is a proper scientific reason behind it. So it's better to know why gravel is used in railway tracks, so you could answer any prelims question on this. So this completes my detailed discussion of today's The Hindu newspaper. Please take up the mains practice questions, write your answers, post it in the answer writing portal, and the link for the portal is given in the description box below. I hope you guys liked the session. Do let me know how the session went through your comments, press the like button and share the video with other aspirants. So that is it from my side. Thanks for watching. Have a good day.